Get out!
Arthur's voice sounded so calm that at first Helen didn't even grasp the meaning of the spoken words. She stood in the middle of the massive living room of their suburban home, clutching a cup of already cold coffee, and looked at her husband as if she expected a continuation. But no continuation followed. Arthur sat in an armchair near the panoramic window, an expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, a gold watch on his wrist. He looked like a man from the cover of a business magazine, exactly how partners, investors, and employees saw him. Successful, confident, unshakable. Only Helen knew the other side of this man. "What did you say?" she asked quietly. He looked up. "I said our marriage is over." Silence claimed the room. Outside the glass, a summer rain was just beginning to fall. The drops slid down the pane with a heavy, deliberate slowness, as if time itself had decided to hit the brakes in this exact moment. "Over," Helen repeated. "Yes, after 15 years. Exactly after 15 years." He spoke the words the way a man discusses the terms of a new corporate merger, hollow, sterile, entirely stripped of human warmth. Helen set the cup down on the table, the porcelain clinking softly. Her fingers were shaking, but not from fear, from a bone-deep, hollow disappointment. Her mind snapped back to the day she first met Arthur. He had nothing back then. A beat-up sedan with a failing transmission and a cramped rental apartment. His dreams were vastly overdrawing his actual bank account. It was Helen who had worked 2 shifts just to keep the lights on. She was the one holding him together when the early investors laughed him out of the room. She sat beside him through the dead of night, hammering out business plans until her eyes burned. She believed in him when the rest of the world wouldn't give him a dime. And now he sat across from her, looking at her like an obsolete piece of hardware. "Is there another woman?" she asked. Arthur gave a short, dismissive smirk. "That doesn't matter anymore." That answer was all it took. Helen closed her eyes, feeling something fundamental and irreplaceable snap right down the center of her chest. "So there is." He simply shrugged. "You're a smart woman. You can put it together." "Who is she?" "My assistant." Helen let out a short, hollow laugh. It was a bitter, joyless sound, like she'd just heard the world's oldest, most pathetic joke. Of course, the assistant. Young, beautiful, ruthlessly ambitious. A walking cliché. And how long? Half a year. 6 months. 6 months of calculated lies. 6 months of manufactured smiles and playing house. A dark, suffocating wave of grief began to rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't going to bleed for him. Never for him. "So what happens now?" Arthur stood up, walked over to the mahogany table, and slid a manila folder toward her. "The paperwork is in here." "What paperwork?" "The prenuptial agreement." Helen furrowed her brow. "What agreement?" "The one you signed years ago." She opened the folder, flipping through the dense legal jargon, and a sudden icy knot tightened in her chest. She remembered. God, she actually remembered. It was back when they were just getting the company off the ground. The corporate lawyer had shoved a mountain of paperwork across a cheap desk. She had signed every single page without reading a word. Because she trusted her husband. Blindly. Absolutely. "According to the agreement," Arthur continued, his voice terrifyingly even, "all assets belong to me." Helen slowly raised her eyes. "What?" "The house is mine. The company is mine. The accounts are mine." She stared at him, trying to find the man she married, but looking at a total stranger. "And what exactly am I left with?" "Your personal belongings." She let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds before repeating it. "My personal belongings." "Yes, after 15 years of marriage, you signed the documents. I trusted you." "That was your mistake." The words hit harder than a closed fist. Helen felt her heart painfully contract, bracing for the tears, but her eyes remained completely dry. It was strange. She expected to scream, to shatter, to beg on her knees. Instead, a freezing, absolute void was expanding inside her. "So you're throwing me out on the street with nothing?" "Legally speaking, it's completely bulletproof." "Legally." She breathed the word out like a ghost. Legally, sure. But that was a different universe entirely. Exactly 1 week later, Helen walked out the front door with 2 suitcases. No screaming matches, no broken plates, no theatrical exits. She signed a lease on a cramped apartment out in the suburbs. For the first time in over a decade, she was breathing the air of a completely empty room. Night after night, she sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker against the dark asphalt. Her phone was a dead brick. Most of their so-called friends had vanished like smoke in a hurricane. Some ghosted her texts, others suddenly had incredibly demanding schedules. People gravitate toward power, and Arthur held all the cards. The Wall Street Journal kept running his glossy portraits. Forbes hailed him as a titan of modern enterprise. Nobody wrote a damn word about the woman who poured the concrete for that empire. Nobody even remembered her name. Except for one person. Late one evening, the phone suddenly buzzed against the table. Helen stared at the screen. An out-of-state area code she didn't recognize. She picked it up. "Hello?" A heavy beat of silence hung on the line. Then a man's voice drifted through the receiver, low, grounded, and impossibly familiar. "Helen." She froze. Her heart skipped a violent beat. "Max?" "Yeah." Helen slowly sank onto the edge of the sofa. She hadn't heard that voice in nearly 10 years, not since her younger brother had packed up and moved overseas. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I just heard the news." "From who?" "That doesn't matter." Max's voice carried a sudden, rigid tension. "Is it true?" Helen closed her eyes tightly. Yes. For a few seconds, the line went dead quiet, a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. "He stripped you down to nothing, and you didn't even call me." "You were busy, Max. I didn't want to." "Don't be an idiot." She could hear him pull in a long, slow breath before delivering a sentence that made her feel for the first time in weeks that she wasn't standing in the dark alone. "When and where is the first hearing?" 3 weeks from now." "All right." "Max, please, don't get involved." A short, dark chuckle echoed through the phone. There was absolutely no humor in it. It sounded dangerous. "I'm afraid it's a little too late for that." The line clicked dead. Helen sat perfectly still for a long time staring at the black screen. She had no idea what her brother was planning. She had no idea how much time had changed the scrawny kid who had bought a one-way ticket out of the country with a single duffel bag and a head full of wild ambition. And she certainly didn't know that at that exact moment, Arthur was sitting in his corner office, smoothly signing another multi-million-dollar contract, utterly convinced that the upcoming court date was nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle. He believed the victory was already locked in his vault. After all, he had the most vicious corporate litigators on retainer. The legal code was heavily stacked in his favor. The money was on his side. It never even crossed his mind that in just a few weeks, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom would swing open and a man he had never once taken seriously would walk down the aisle, wiping the smug certainty off the face of every single person in the room. The morning of the hearing broke ugly and gray. Thick, bruised clouds choked the skyline, and a heavy, suffocating humidity hung over the city like a threat of a violent storm. Helen sat on a hard wooden bench out in the courthouse corridor, her knuckles white around a cheap cardboard folder. Her attorney sat next to her, an aging public defender type with exhausted eyes and a nervous habit of pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He had already leveled with her more than once. The odds were practically non-existent. She knew that. She knew it deep in her marrow. The prenuptial agreement was rock solid. From a strictly legal standpoint, Arthur's armor was completely impenetrable. That was exactly why he strolled through the courthouse rotunda with the swagger of a reigning king, flanked by 2 tailored sharks from a white shoe law firm. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and that trademark self-satisfied smile of a man who already read the final score. When his eyes flicked over to Helen, he gave a barely perceptible nod. Not the nod of a man looking at his wife of 15 years, but a guy acknowledging a stranger in an elevator. She didn't react. She just turned her head. Minutes later, the bailiff called them in. The judge took the bench, and the gears of the machine began to turn. The first hour played out exactly the way Arthur had mapped it in his head. His legal team systematically laid out the paperwork, quoting clauses, subclauses, verified signatures, and established corporate precedents. Every argument they dropped felt like a lead weight. Every subsequent point felt heavier than the last. Helen felt a cold sweat of panic rising in her chest. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but the reality of the room was suffocating. The entire system was designed to crush her. And right at that moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Half the gallery whipped their heads around. The court reporter shot a glaring look over her monitor. The judge deepened her scowl, ready to strike the gavel, but a second later, the irritation vanished from her face. A tall man in a midnight blue Tom Ford suit strode down the center aisle. He moved with a terrifying, predatory calm. Right behind him walked a phalanx of 3. 2 high-powered litigators and a woman typing rapidly on a tablet. Helen stopped breathing. She recognized her brother instantly, even though the years had chiseled away the soft edges of the boy she remembered. You could pass him on the street and never know him. The scrappy kid dreaming of a better life was dead and buried. In his place stood a man who routinely moved mountains and commanded thousands. Max bypassed the gallery without breaking stride. The courtroom erupted into a low, buzzing static of whispers. First a murmur, then a rising tide. Somebody in the back row had definitely recognized him. Thumbs were flying across smartphone screens. Arthur narrowed his eyes. He stared at Max for a long, calculating beat, digging through his mental Rolodex to place the face, and then all the blood drained out of Arthur's cheeks. It was a subtle shift, just a slight graying of the skin, but it was enough. Helen saw it, and for the first time in a very long time, a dark, satisfying warmth bloomed in her chest. Because right then, her untouchable ex-husband finally looked like a man who could bleed. Max stopped at the plaintiff's table, casually dropping a sleek leather folio in front of his lead counsel. Then he slowly turned his head to lock eyes with Arthur. "Morning." Arthur practically had to physically force the corners of his mouth to curve up. "Max, it's been a long time." "It really has." To the untrained eye, the exchange looked like 2 old friends bumping into each other at a country club. But the kinetic tension in the room was suffocating. It tasted like copper in the air right before a lightning strike. The judge slammed her gavel, demanding order. The proceedings resumed. Max's lead attorney buttoned his jacket and stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests the admission of supplemental evidentiary materials." Arthur shot a rapid, nervous glance at his own legal team. They looked irritated, sighing at the procedural delay, entirely confident in their ironclad defense. Right up until the moment the clerk handed them the file, Arthur's senior partner was the first to physically react. The color washed out of his face. Then the junior partner stiffened. Finally, Arthur snatched the paper. He flipped through the first 3 pages frantically. Then he did it again. He stared at the ink as if sheer willpower could make the text vaporize. It didn't. Max watched the meltdown happen in real time, completely motionless. No smirk, no victory lap, just watching a bug under glass. "What the hell is this?" Arthur finally hissed. "Just some very interesting reading material," Max replied smoothly. "Where did you get this?" That was the million-dollar question. Max's attorney took the floor, and with every passing minute, the oxygen in the room seemed to burn away. He laid out a surgical deconstruction of the past. Years ago, Arthur's startup had survived on a highly convoluted chain of venture capital. On paper, the shell game looked totally legit, but buried deep in the corporate filings were radioactive details that nobody had ever bothered to audit, details irrevocably tied to Helen. It was her signature on the mezzanine financing that secured the foundational contracts. It was her personal credit and private assets leveraged as collateral during the company's near-death valley phase. Her direct financial backing was the only concrete wall standing between Arthur and bankruptcy in those early days. A decade ago, those moves looked like minor marital bookkeeping. Today, under the fluorescent lights of a federal courtroom, they were a loaded gun pointed directly at Arthur's empire. Arthur kept dropping his eyes to the documents, then snapping them back to Max. The mild irritation in his eyes warped into naked anger and then slowly into cold panic. Max just sat there, carved out of stone, as if he had memorized the script of this exact moment years in advance. The judge called a brief recess. The second the gavel hit, Arthur shoved his chair back and marched straight across the aisle. "Did you orchestrate this?" "Orchestrate what exactly?" "Cut the act. I've never put on an act in my life. This is a family matter." Max held his gaze without blinking. "That's exactly why I'm sitting here." "Your sister is a grown woman." "She is. She doesn't need you playing white knight." "I'm not trying to save her." "Then what the hell are you doing?" Max tilted his head just a fraction. "I just have a very low tolerance for rigged games." Arthur let out a wet, contemptuous scoff. "Really? You think buying a nice suit and having a heavy bank account gives you the right to crash into my life?" This time Max actually smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, freezing expression. "That is incredibly rich coming from you." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped between the two men. Then Max leaned in. "You know what actually blows my mind, Arthur? The fact that you honestly believed after everything she built for you that she'd be standing in the dark, alone." Arthur couldn't find a single word to fire back, because right then, a brutal realization was sinking its teeth into his neck. For over a decade, Arthur had obsessively monitored his corporate rivals, tracked market volatility, and hedged against hostile takeovers. But he had completely forgotten to run a background check on the kid brother his wife used to talk about. In the years they had been estranged, Max hadn't just gotten rich. He had built a global private equity syndicate valued in the billions. The man sitting across from him wasn't an emotional relative throwing a tantrum. He was an apex predator who dismantled corporations for sport. When court reconvened, the atmospheric pressure in the room had shifted so violently that even the bored bailiff sitting by the door could feel it. That morning, Arthur had walked in holding the leash. Now he was practically climbing over the table, frantically whispering to his counsel. His lawyers were furiously scribbling notes, sweating through their expensive shirts, repeatedly standing up to beg the judge for more time to review the discovery. Helen watched the massacre unfold with quiet awe. She used to know her brother, or she thought she did, but the man pulling the strings a few feet away operated without a drop of raw emotion. He moved his pieces across the board with ruthless, chilling precision. The judge nodded to the plaintiff's table. One of Max's junior partners took the podium, a young guy with the relaxed posture of a sniper. He didn't yell, he didn't pace. He simply laid out the timeline with a surgical detachment that made the facts hit 10 times harder. Every claim was backed by a hard copy paper trail. Every accusation was chained to an audited bank record. Slowly, the narrative in the room began to pivot. This wasn't a messy argument over a prenuptial agreement anymore. The blast radius was getting exponentially wider. The lawyer mapped out how, in the chaotic first 3 years of the startup, Arthur had constantly bypassed legal roadblocks by utilizing power of attorney documents signed by Helen. She was the ultimate guarantor. She absorbed the absolute risk. Sure, individually, the filings were drafted to make her look like a silent secondary partner, but when you stitched the mosaic together, the illusion shattered. The empire was built on her credit score. By the time the lawyer clicked his folder shut, you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. Arthur wasn't adjusting his cuffs or flashing his arrogant smile anymore. He sat rigidly in his leather chair, staring at the wood grain, looking exactly like a man who had just realized the brakes on his car had been cut. When the gavel finally fell to end the session, a swarm of journalists was already bottlenecking the courthouse steps. The blood was in the water, and the news cycle was spinning up fast. Within hours, the financial blogs were pushing the photos to their front pages. Nobody gave a damn about the divorce anymore. The headline was Max, the phantom CEO of a global conglomerate, stepping out of the shadows to nuke his former brother-in-law. By nightfall, Arthur's phone was melting down. Venture capitalists, board members, institutional investors. Some were fishing for gossip, others were openly threatening to pull their capital. A spotless Wall Street reputation takes 20 years to build and about 4 hours to burn to the ground. Arthur knew the math. He sat alone in his darkened office, the blue light of his laptop illuminating the sweat on his forehead. Staring back at him was an op-ed piece. The banner photo showed him walking down the courthouse steps looking like a deer in headlights, with Helen and Max trailing like executioners. The headline was a kill shot. The shadow founder tycoon's ex-wife demands equity in tech empire. Arthur slammed the laptop shut just as the heavy glass door to his office swung open. Victoria walked in, the assistant, the woman he had blown up his life for. "You're still here?" she asked. "It's almost midnight." He pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a migraine pulsing behind his eyes. "I'm not exactly in a sleeping mood." Victoria stepped closer. "Is it really that bad?" "Not officially." "Then why do you look like a guy who just lost everything?" Arthur looked up at her, and a sickening realization washed over him. He didn't want to answer her because he didn't actually know the answer himself. Just 3 weeks ago, the math was incredibly simple. File the papers, execute the prenup, upgrade the lifestyle. Now the steering wheel had completely snapped off the column. "This brother of hers," Victoria said softly. "What's his deal? Who is he really?" Arthur let out a dry, rattling laugh. "That is the million-dollar question." He unlocked his phone, pulled up a Bloomberg profile, and shoved the screen toward her. Victoria started skimming the text. At first, her face was blank. Then her eyes locked onto a paragraph widening in real time. "Wait, hold on. This is Max, the CEO of Global Holdings." "Yeah. The private equity monolith?" "Exactly." Victoria slowly sank into the leather guest chair. The silence stretched out thick and heavy. "Why did you never mention this to me?" "Because I didn't know." "How is that even possible? I thought you said he was a drifter who vanished a decade ago." She stared down at the screen again. The market capitalization numbers listed in the article looked like a typo. Dozens of international subsidiaries, millions of global assets, a corporate valuation with a B, and the guy holding the keys to the castle was the fiercely protective younger brother of the woman Arthur had just tried to leave with pocket change. Victoria slowly looked up from the glowing screen. "I think you might have underestimated him." "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." Across town, high above the glowing grid of the city, Max was sitting in a glass-walled penthouse suite. A mountain of legal discovery files covered the glass table. Helen sat across from him. "I don't want a bloodbath, Max," she said quietly. Max didn't look up from the deposition transcript. "Who said anything about a bloodbath, did you?" "No." "Me neither." He smiled. This time it was warm, genuinely warm. The kind of smile she remembered from when they were kids. "Helen, do you honestly think I flew across the country just to play a revenge game?" "Aren't you—" "No." She looked at him genuinely confused. "Then why do all this?" Max let the silence hang for a moment. He leaned back in his chair. "Because I left you alone in the dark for way too long." The raw, unfiltered honesty in his voice caught her off guard. A hard lump formed in Helen's throat. "You didn't do anything wrong, Max. It wasn't your fault." "Maybe," he said, shaking his head. "But when I pulled the curtain back and saw what you've been living through for the last few years, there are just some debts you can't walk away from." She broke eye contact. "It just feels surreal. I can't believe this is actually happening. You're a completely different person now." Max chuckled softly. "So are you." "What does that mean?" "It means you still don't understand what you're actually worth." Helen opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. Deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent a decade and a half living in the shade of her husband's towering ego. She had treated her own sacrifices like they were just the price of admission, letting a room full of suits take the credit for the foundation she poured. Max closed the heavy legal binder with a definitive thud. Tomorrow morning is going to be a lot more entertaining. Why? He checked his watch, then tapped the lid of his laptop. Because tomorrow morning we're putting a ghost on the stand to testify on the record. Who? Arthur's original chief financial officer. Helen narrowed her eyes. And what exactly does that change? Max let out a long, slow exhale. Absolutely everything. You're starting to scare me, Max. Don't be scared. Then tell me what's happening. That old enigmatic smirk crept back onto his face. The look of a guy holding 4 aces and waiting for you to bet the house. Let's just say the paperwork we dropped on the table today was barely scraping the paint off the bumper. Helen felt a chill trace its way down her spine. Max, what exactly did your people find? He didn't answer immediately. He stood up, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, and stared down at the sprawling electric veins of the city. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I found the guy who buried the bodies. He's been sitting on a radioactive secret about how Arthur actually built this empire. And if he gets up on that stand tomorrow and tells the truth under oath, Arthur isn't going to be worrying about splitting the china. He's going to be fighting for his life. Arthur woke up hours before his alarm. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Max sitting in that courtroom, radiating that effortless, terrifying calm. That was the part that was eating Arthur alive. Guys who were bluffing were loud. Guys who were insecure threw their weight around. Max barely spoke. He didn't issue threats. He didn't posture for the cameras. And that absolute silence was pumping pure, unfiltered panic straight into Arthur's veins. When his driver pulled up to the corporate plaza, his legal team was already pacing in the lobby. One look at their faces told him the floor was falling out. The senior partner followed Arthur into his office and immediately locked the heavy oak door. We need to talk, right now. Spit it out. The lawyer slapped a manila envelope onto the glass desk. We ran the back channels on the old CFO. He's officially been subpoenaed and he's going to testify. Arthur scoffed. That doesn't prove a damn thing. In a vacuum, no. Then what's the fatal flaw? The lawyer paused, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. The flaw is the narrative. He didn't resign for personal reasons. He was forced out. The ambient hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt deafening. Arthur slowly looked up from the desk. Where are you going with this? The HR archives show a massive internal war between the two of you right before he left. If he gets on the stand and starts airing out the dirty laundry, things are going to get incredibly ugly. Arthur shot out of his chair. Ugly for the stock price or ugly for me? The lawyer just stared at him. The silence was 10 times worse than a guilty verdict. 2 hours later, the courtroom doors swung open. This time there wasn't an empty seat in the gallery. Journalists were crammed into the aisles, notebooks ready. Max's sudden explosive entrance into the narrative had mutated a standard high-net-worth divorce into the biggest corporate thriller of the decade. When the former CFO walked through the heavy wooden doors, a ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. His name was Ian Vance, mid-60s, silver hair neatly parted, eyes entirely deadpan. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look intimidated by the glare of the cameras. He looked like a man who had made his peace with the devil a long time ago. He took the oath, sat down, and adjusted the microphone. Max's attorney approached the box. Mr. Vance, how many years were you employed by the defendant's corporation? Nearly 12. And your official title? Chief Financial Officer. Are you intimately familiar with the financial architecture of the company's founding? Intimately, yes. The room went dead silent. You could literally hear the scratch of reporters' pens on paper. Please tell the court what exact role did Helen play during the critical launch phase of this enterprise? Ian shifted his gaze. He looked past the lawyers, past Arthur, and locked eyes with Helen. Then he looked up at the judge. She was the linchpin. Just one word, but it detonated like a frag grenade. Arthur's jaw locked. His lawyers started scribbling furiously. Please elaborate for the record. In the first 36 months, the company was hemorrhaging cash. We were weeks away from insolvency. And what exactly kept the lights on? Injections of capital. Whose capital, Mr. Vance? Ian paused, letting the silence stretch for maximum impact. Helen's. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge cracked her gavel twice to kill the noise. The witness leaned into the mic. She liquidated inherited assets. She abandoned her own career. She drained her personal savings and personally guaranteed 3 separate bridge loans to keep the corporate accounts afloat. Is this reflected in the official ledger? Partially. Why only partially? This time, Ian stared directly at Arthur, a cold, unwavering stare. Because retroactively, the internal ledgers were scrubbed and reclassified. Arthur bolted out of his chair. Objection, Your Honor, this is wild speculation. Is it an assumption, Mr. Vance? The judge asked, peering over her glasses. No, Your Honor, Ian replied smoothly. It is an audited fact. Helen's heart started hammering violently against her ribs. She had never heard any of this. She had never been allowed past the frosted glass doors of the accounting department. She had no idea how deep the rot actually went. The interrogation dragged on. Brick by brick, ledger by ledger, the attorney built a devastating timeline. The corporate mythology of the self-made genius was being systematically butchered. But the actual kill shot didn't land until 30 minutes later. Mr. Vance, what was the specific catalyst for your departure from the firm? For the first time, the old CFO actually hesitated. I refused to authorize a stack of internal documents. The courtroom held its collective breath. What kind of documents? Quarterly financial disclosures. And why did you refuse? Because they were a work of fiction. Pure, unadulterated rage flooded Arthur's face. The mask completely slipped. Max caught it out of the corner of his eye but didn't flinch. He just kept watching the board. Are you testifying that the official reporting was deliberately manipulated? Yes. To what end? To mathematically erase the equity contributions of specific individuals. Which individuals? Primarily Helen. In the gallery, 30 different reporters started hammering on their phones at the exact same time. The push notifications were hitting Wall Street terminals as they spoke. Arthur felt the blood rushing in his ears. This wasn't a messy divorce anymore. This was a massive securities fraud scandal. His investors, his board, his entire legacy, it was all standing on a trap door. The judge called a mandatory recess. Arthur didn't wait for his lawyers. He bypassed the table and walked straight up to Max. No fake smiles, no country club etiquette. What is your end game here? Max looked up at him entirely unbothered. Accountability. Stop feeding me that fortune cookie garbage. Are you trying to tank my stock? You want to burn the company to the ground. I'm not burning anything, Max said softly. You lit the match. I'm just letting you feel the heat. Arthur's hands balled into tight fists. You think you have the moral high ground here. You think you're my judge. Not at all. Then why the hell are you doing this? Max's eyes went dead cold. Because 15 years ago, my sister handed you her entire life. A heavy, brutal silence fell between them. And what did you do? You weaponized her loyalty, bled her dry, and tried to throw her in the trash. Arthur turned his head away. A sudden, crushing wave of exhaustion crashed down on his shoulders. It felt like the oxygen in the room was physically draining his life force. When the session finally adjourned for the day, a mob of cameras blocked the courthouse exit. Questions were flying like shrapnel. Max didn't give them a single syllable. Helen walked right past the microphones. But the real earthquake hit a few hours after sunset. One of the largest institutional hedge funds on the street issued a press release. They were officially freezing all capital injections into Arthur's firm pending a full forensic audit. The headline hit Bloomberg and CNBC simultaneously. The after-hours stock price fell off a cliff. Arthur's private cell phone started vibrating off the desk, but this time, nobody was calling to offer moral support. The sharks were circling. They wanted blood, they wanted guarantees, and they wanted answers. At midnight, he was still sitting in the dark. On his desk sat the printed transcript of Ian Vance's testimony. Right next to it lay a separate manila folder his crisis team had couriered over an hour ago. It contained a document he hadn't thought about in over a decade. A piece of paper that had the power to rewrite reality. Arthur slowly peeled back the cover sheet. He read the first 3 paragraphs, and for the first time since this nightmare started, genuine, paralyzing terror gripped his chest. Because right there at the bottom of the page was his own signature in blue ink. It was a binding covenant that legally tethered Helen to a massive chunk of the intellectual property he had assumed was solely his. If the judge validated that single sheet of paper tomorrow morning, his empire wasn't just getting divided, it was getting hijacked. The next morning began with a sickening jolt. Arthur was in the back of his town car when his phone buzzed. It was the chairman of the board. Guys like that didn't make direct phone calls, they had fixers do it. Arthur knew instantly that the dam had broken. "We need an emergency session the minute you're out of court today. Mandatory." "What's the panic?" Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice level. A long pause hung on the line. "The institutional backers are spooked, Arthur. It's a temporary dip. We'll weather it." "I pray to God you're right." The line went dead before Arthur could formulate a spin. He tossed the phone onto the leather seat and stared out the tinted glass. The city was waking up. Commuters clutching coffee cups, delivery trucks idling at red lights. The world was spinning on its axis, completely indifferent to the fact that his personal universe was violently tearing itself apart. When the car pulled up to the courthouse, the media circus had tripled in size. The flashbulbs were blinding.